They saw the African jail wrapped around her head and assumed she didn't belong. They saw the vibrant purple Ankara dress with its golden embroidery, 6 yards of hand-printed fabric that had traveled across an ocean, and decided she was causing a disturbance. They saw a 70-year-old black woman standing peacefully in her own living room, in the home she had owned for 32 years, in the house where she had raised children who grew into people who mattered, and they concluded she was a threat that needed to be neutralized. What Officer Carl Patton didn't know, what his arrogance and his prejudice wouldn't let him see, was that the elderly woman he was about to put his hands on wasn't just some immigrant grandmother he could bully without consequence. She wasn't a woman without a voice or without power. She wasn't someone who would file a complaint that would be quietly buried under a stack of union paperwork and forgotten before the ink dried. She was Betty Williams, mother, grandmother, nurse, survivor of a civil war that had consumed an entire generation and left its marks on her body in the form of shrapnel scars along her arms and back. A woman who had walked out of a refugee camp in 1982, holding an infant and a nursing diploma, with no money, no connections, no English beyond what she had taught herself from borrowed textbooks, and had built a life from that absolute zero, with nothing but her hands and her faith and a will that would have stopped a truck. And most importantly, most critically, in ways that Carl Patton was about to discover at the worst possible moment of his 9-year career. Betty Williams was the woman who had raised Kevin Williams, the youngest U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, a federal prosecutor who had built his reputation and his career on one specific thing: dismantling corrupt police departments and the cultures of impunity that protected them. On that Sunday afternoon in Newark, New Jersey, Officer Carl Patton kicked down the door of 1847 Ashford Street, based on a dispatch call he didn't bother to verify. He walked into a home that smelled of jollof rice and fried plantains, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that has been alive since 5 in the morning. He grabbed Betty Williams, this woman in her finest traditional dress, this woman with the Jill tied high above her silver hair like a crown she had more than earned, by her arms, and threw her to the floor of her own home like she was nothing. Like she was an inconvenience, like she was a problem to be subdued rather than a human being to be heard. He laughed when she cried out in Igbo from the pain. He mocked her accent. He drove his knee into her back and put handcuffs on wrists that had never done a criminal thing in 70 years of living. He didn't check the address. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pause for one single second to consider that he might be wrong. But Officer Carl Patton made one fatal miscalculation that afternoon that no union rep, no department supervisor, and no amount of paperwork was ever going to be able to fix. Well, Betty Williams had raised a son who understood exactly how power works, how it can be dismantled, and how the law, the real law, the federal law, the law with teeth, responds when one of its own is used against the innocent. A son who was, at that exact moment, pulling into the driveway of 1847 Ashford Street with birthday flowers and a bakery box from his mother's favorite Harlem patisserie. The front door was hanging off its hinges. His mother was on the floor, and Officer Carl Patton was standing over her with his hand on his taser, breathing hard, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who considers the situation handled. What happened next would take down not just Carl Patton, but an entire precinct's institutional culture of abuse, expose a decade and a half of buried complaints and silenced victims, and prove beyond any reasonable doubt that sometimes karma wears a charcoal suit and carries the full weight of the United States Department of Justice in its briefcase. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I personally read and respond to every single one. This story needs witnesses, because what happened to Betty Williams isn't rare. It's just rarely prosecuted. hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's get into it. Newark, New Jersey. Sunday, March 12th, 2:30 in the afternoon. The house at 1847 Ashford Street was Betty Williams's sanctuary. Not just a house, a sanctuary. At 70 years old, Betty had lived within those walls for 32 years. And in 32 years, when a house stops being a structure and becomes something else entirely, it becomes the physical record of a life. Every room told a story. Every corner held a memory. The photographs from Nigeria crowding the mantel. The nursing diploma from Lagos University, framed in dark wood, hanging in the hallway, where visitors would see it first. The hand-embroidered throw pillows her sister had sent from Enugu that Betty had never allowed on the couch. Those lived in their own box under the guest bed, brought out only for the most special occasions. The kitchen, which was the true heart of the house, which had smelled like something magnificent every single day for 3 decades, because Betty Williams did not believe in eating poorly or in feeding her family anything less than the best she was capable of producing. On the mantel, so next to the row of family photographs, sat a framed Nigerian flag, green, white, green, and beside it, a photograph of Betty at 23. She was impossibly thin in that photograph, the kind of thin that comes not from discipline but from deprivation. She was standing in a camp. You could see the tents behind her, the dusty ground, the flat, exhausted sky of a country in the middle of consuming itself. She was holding an infant wrapped in a piece of cloth. The infant was Kevin. The year was 1982. It was 3 years after Betty had fled the dying end of the Biafran conflict, with nothing but the clothes she stood in, her nursing diploma rolled into a waterproof tube and strapped to her body, and the unborn child she was determined to deliver into a better world than the one that was burning around her. Betty didn't talk about the war often. She had made a deliberate, considered decision decades ago that the war would not be the organizing story of her life, that it would be part of her history without being the whole of it. But the scars on her arms and the left side of her back, pale and irregular against her dark skin, permanent constellations of old shrapnel that the doctors had deemed safer to leave than to remove. Those told the story, without any words being necessary. Betty Williams had stared down death in the most direct, literal, physical sense that a human being can stare it down, and she had refused to blink. That refusal, that fundamental, bone-deep, non-negotiable refusal to be extinguished, was the most essential thing about her. Signed the thing that had carried her out of that camp and across an ocean and through 23 years of double shifts at University Hospital, and through the death of her husband Amika, when Kevin was 14, and David was 11, and Grace was 8, and through every subsequent hard thing that life had placed in her path. Today was Kevin's 42nd birthday. Betty had been in the kitchen since 5 in the morning. The jollof rice was in a large pot on the back burner, simmering in a tomato and pepper base that she had blended herself from fresh ingredients the day before. Beside it, a pot of egusi soup, rich with ground melon seeds, stockfish that had been soaking since Friday, and chunks of goat meat from the halal butcher on Ferry Street, who knew her by name and always set aside the best cuts when she called ahead. On the counter, covered with a clean dish towel, sat a plate of puff-puff, the small, soft, perfectly round fried dough balls dusted with sugar that Kevin had been requesting since before he could form complete sentences. A bowl of fried plantains, still warm, a pot of white rice, a separate container of pepper soup made specifically because Kevin's sister Grace had developed a taste for it over the last few years and would be heartbroken to arrive and find there was none. Betty was wearing her finest Ankara boo-boo. It was a flowing, wide-sleeved garment in deep imperial purple, the fabric printed with a pattern of interlocking geometric forms in gold and ivory, that caught and held the light in the way that only truly good fabric does. The embroidery along the collar and the cuffs was done in gold thread, hand-stitched, from the work of a tailor in Lagos whose waiting list was 6 months long and whom Betty's sister had engaged on her behalf as a birthday gift 3 years ago. On her head sat a jela, the traditional Nigerian head wrap, tied in the high, elaborate, confident style that women of Betty's generation had mastered before they could drive, a style that required both skill and intention, a style that said clearly and without apology, "I know who I am." Around her neck hung amber beads the color of dark honey, her mother's beads, the only physical object Betty had managed to carry out of the conflict. On her wrists, copper bangles, thin ones, half a dozen, that had been a wedding gift from Emeka 38 years ago, and that Betty had not taken off since the day he put them there. Her feet were bare on the kitchen tile, and they were always bare inside the house. She was humming a highlife song, one of Fela's, though she would never have admitted to her church friends that she knew Fela's catalog as well as she did, when her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Grace. "Mama, Kevin's planning to surprise you. He's on his way. Should be there around 3. Betty smiled at the phone. She had known. A mother always knows when her child is coming. There is something in the atmosphere that shifts, a kind of barometric change, when someone you love is moving toward you. She had felt it since morning, the same way she felt rain before it arrived. She set the phone down and turned back to the stove. And then came the sound. 3 blows against the front door. Not knocks, impacts. The sound of a fist used as a battering ram, then the sound of authority performing itself at maximum volume. Boom, boom, boom. "Police! Open the door! Right now!" Betty's hand went immediately to her chest, not in a theatrical gesture, in a genuine, involuntary response, because Betty Williams had a heart that had been giving her intermittent trouble for 3 years, and that responded poorly to sudden shocks. She stood very still for exactly 2 seconds, her hand pressed flat against her sternum, feeling her heartbeat stutter and then re-establish its rhythm. Police. Why would there be police? She had done nothing. She had been in this kitchen since 5 in the morning. She had spoken to no one except her sister by phone at 7, and she had opened her front door for no one except the delivery driver who brought the stockfish from the African grocery at 9:30. "I'm coming," she called out. She turned the burner under the jollof down to its lowest setting and moved toward the front of the house. Her arthritis made her hands slow on the locks. It always did, particularly in the morning and particularly in the cold, though today was not cold. The March air was actually mild for New Jersey. She fumbled with the deadbolt. "1 moment, please. I am opening it." "Open the door now or we're breaking it down." "I am opening it," Betty called back, the anxiety in her voice genuine and audible. The voice of a woman who has lived a life that has included encounters with authority that was not benign, who knows in her body that the period between a door and what comes through it can change everything. She didn't get to finish. The door didn't just open. It exploded inward. So Officer Carl Patton of the Newark Police Department had put the full force of his steel-toed boot into the frame at precisely the moment Betty's fingers were on the deadbolt. And the old frame, 32 years old, wood that had weathered 3 decades of New Jersey winters, splintered and gave way. The door flew inward with a sound like a gunshot. It hit the interior wall and bounced back. Betty, who had been reaching for the lock, stumbled backward from the impact, her hip catching the edge of the hallway table, her arms reaching out for something to hold on to. She found nothing. 2 uniformed officers came through the door. The first was Carl Patton, white, mid-40s, thickly built, the kind of physical presence that fills a doorway not because of height, but because of a certain occupying quality, a quality of deliberate expansion. His face was already flushed, already wearing an expression that was a few steps past professional, already somewhere in the territory of something more personal and more unpleasant than the execution of a duty. His right hand hovered near the holster at his hip with the too-ready quality of someone who arrived at the situation already committed to a particular outcome. His name tag, visible in the afternoon light coming through the shattered doorframe, read, Patton. Behind him came Officer Marcus Reed. Younger, late 20s, black. With the careful, watchful stillness of someone who has learned to be careful and watchful in the particular environment he occupies. He looked at the hallway, at Betty, at Patton's back, and his face was readable to anyone who was paying attention. He was uncomfortable, so not so uncomfortable that he had said anything. Not yet. But uncomfortable in the way that people are uncomfortable when they know something is wrong and have not yet decided what they are going to do about that knowledge. Betty pressed both hands against her chest, feeling her heart, making sure it was still doing what it was supposed to do. What, officer? What is happening? What is this? I have done nothing. There is no one else here. Where is he? Patton barked. He was looking around the hallway with the eyes of a man who has decided what he's going to find before he looks for it. Where's the suspect? We have a call. Domestic disturbance. Someone with a weapon. There is no one here, Betty said. Her voice was shaking, but her words were precise. Officer, I live alone. My son is coming to visit later this afternoon. But right now, I am the only person in this house. I have been cooking since this morning. There has been no disturbance. I think, perhaps... She took a steadying breath, reaching for the patient. Careful register she had learned to use in situations where patience and care were survival tools. I think perhaps you have the wrong address. Is it possible the call was for Ashford Street? That is 3 blocks from here. The names are similar, and there is sometimes confusion. I know how to read an address, Patton said. He said it the way people say things they need to believe, rather than things they know are true. He turned to Reed. Check the back rooms. I'll secure her. Officer, please, Betty said, and she moved, not toward him, not in any aggressive direction, but to the side. The instinctive movement of a woman who is trying to stay out of the path of something she can feel is coming. I am telling you, this is a misunderstanding. You are welcome to check the house. But please, my stove is on. I have soup on the stove that will burn. Please let me go to the kitchen. Don't move, Patton said. Betty stopped. She looked at him very carefully. She had seen this before. Not often. Not often enough to be inured to it, but often enough to recognize it. The thing in his eyes that was not about her at all. The thing that was about him, about something he had brought into this house from outside it. Something that had nothing to do with the dispatch call, or the address, or anything that Betty Williams had done or not done. He was looking at her the way certain people look at things they have decided don't deserve to look back. You're not cooperating, Patton said. I am trying to cooperate, Betty said. I am standing still. I am answering your questions. I am telling you the truth. I don't know what else you want from me, officer. I want you to stop talking. He stepped toward her. I want you to put your hands where I can see them, and I want you to stop moving. My hands are right here, Betty said. She raised them, palms forward, the copper bangles sliding down her wrists with a soft, jingling sound. You can see them. I am not moving. I am simply asking. You're being combative. Betty Williams, who had survived a war, who had worked 23 years of double shifts, who had raised 3 children alone and put all 3 of them through college, who had testified before a hospital review board at age 65 about nursing standards and had been called the most composed witness the board chairman had ever seen. Betty Williams looked at this man and felt something move through her that was very old and very tired. I am not being combative, she said quietly. I am being clear." Carl Patton's jaw tightened. He stepped forward into her personal space, using his size the way certain people use their size. Not for protection, not for legitimate authority, but as a substitute for both. Betty held her ground, not because she wasn't afraid. Her heart was hammering in a way that frightened her, but because backing away from him felt like a concession she was not willing to make in her own hallway, in front of her own family photographs, but on the hardwood floor she had polished with her own hands for 32 years. "You're going to step aside," Patton said, "and let me do my job." "Do you have a warrant?" Betty asked. The word hit Carl Patton like a match hitting something dry. The color in his face deepened from its existing flush into something darker and more committed. Something shifted in him, something that a more honest person, reflecting on it later, might have identified as the moment he stopped responding to the situation in front of him and started responding to something much older and much uglier that he carried inside himself. "You, standing there in your little costume, barely speaking English, are going to tell me how to do my job." His voice had dropped. It was quieter now, which made it worse. "You think you know your rights? You think that's going to help you?" Betty's eyes flashed. She had been called many things in 70 years of living. This particular category of thing she had also been called before. It never got easier. It never stopped feeling like what it was. Like a hand reaching into you to take something that wasn't the other person's to take. "This is not a costume," she said. Her voice had changed too, steadied somehow, the way a flame steadies itself inside a glass when the draft stops. "This is my traditional dress. I am Nigerian. I have lived in this house for 32 years. I have paid my taxes. I have committed no crime. And you will not speak to me that way in my own home." It was the wrong thing to say, not because it was untrue or unreasonable. Every word of it was both. It was the wrong thing to say because Carl Patton was a man who responded to dignity from certain people the way a body responds to a foreign object, with the immediate, aggressive impulse to expel it. His hand shot out and grabbed her upper arm. Not with the controlled, measured grip of a trained professional assessing a situation. With the grip of a man who has made a decision about what this is and what needs to happen next. His fingers closed around Betty's upper arm, on the left side, where the shrapnel scars ran, where the tissue had never fully recovered its normal density, and he squeezed with a force that was entirely disproportionate to the situation, which was an elderly woman standing in her own hallway with her hands in the air. The pain was immediate and blinding, so Betty cried out, a sound that was part pain and part shock, the sound of a body registering something it did not expect and cannot immediately process. She pulled away instinctively. She was 70 years old, and her hip had been troubling her since spring, and her balance was not what it had been at 50. But the reflex was unstoppable, the absolute human reflex to move away from the source of pain. "Stop resisting," Patton shouted, and in the fraction of a second, it took him to say those two words he had already made the next decision. He yanked Betty's arm, hard. She spun. She couldn't help it. The force of the yank was enough to spin her, her feet in their bare soles on the hardwood, no grip, no leverage, and then he swept her legs. Betty Williams went down, not gradually, not the kind of fall where you have a moment to prepare, and to reach, to protect yourself. She went down completely, and suddenly, the way a structure goes when its support is removed all at once, and she hit the hardwood floor face first because there was nothing, no wall, no furniture close enough, no one's hand to stop her. The sound of her cheekbone against the floor was the kind of sound that, once heard, cannot be categorized as anything other than what it is. Her jewel came loose. It fell away from her head and lay on the floor beside her, the elaborate, carefully tied fabric collapsing out of its shape like something deflated. Her glasses, the reading glasses she'd been wearing to monitor the stove, flew off her face and skittered across the hardwood. The amber beads at her throat, her mother's beads, the beads she had carried out of a war, caught on the floor as she fell, and the strand snapped, and the small honey-colored beads scattered across the polished wood in every direction, rolling into corners, disappearing under furniture, spreading like broken prayers across the floor of the house, where Betty Williams had lived for 32 years. The pain in her hip was white-hot and absolute. She couldn't scream. The breath had been knocked out of her completely. She pressed her cheek, the left one, the one that had struck the floor, against the hardwood and breathed. Just breathed. In the way that people breathe in the immediate aftermath of catastrophic pain, when breathing is the only available action, and therefore becomes the entire focus of consciousness. Patton. Wait. Officer Reed's voice came from the back hallway. He had appeared, his face pale, his hand slightly raised in a gesture of alarm. Patton, the back rooms are empty. There's no one here. The house is empty. Cuff her, Patton said. He was already dropping his knee into the small of Betty's back. Not placed, dropped, with weight. Betty's breath left her again in a rush, and she made a sound that was not quite a cry, not quite a moan. Something in between that is the specific sound of pain that has exceeded a person's ability to process it. She's hurt, man, Reed said. She's really hurt. She's resisting, Patton said. Cuff her, Reed. Right now. And this is the moment that would haunt Marcus Reed for years afterward. The moment he reached for his handcuffs instead of for his radio. The moment he told himself he didn't know enough to intervene. The moment he chose the hierarchy over the woman on the floor. He cuffed Betty Williams. Please, Betty said into the floor. The word was almost inaudible. Please. I am 70 years old. I have done nothing. My hip. I think my hip is... You should have cooperated, Patton said. He stood up, breathing through his mouth. He looked down at her, the way you look at a task you've completed. You're under arrest. Obstruction and assault on a police officer. Betty said nothing. She pressed her face against the hardwood and breathed and did not give him the satisfaction of another sound. The handcuffs were too tight. She could feel it immediately. The metal ratcheted down past the point of restraint into the point of injury, the edges pressing against bone, cutting into the papery skin of her wrists. She said nothing about that either. The copper bangles that Emeka had given her on their wedding day sat pressed flat beneath the metal of the cuffs. The agusai soup on the stove in the kitchen was beginning to stick to the bottom of the pot. Kevin Williams had left his office in Lower Manhattan at noon, which was optimistic by 45 minutes given the Sunday Bridge traffic, and had spent the last 4 hours learning that optimism about New Jersey transit was a specific and recurring form of self-deception. He had his mother's favorite flowers, yellow alstroemeria, not roses, because his mother had told him once 20 years ago that roses were unimaginative, and the information had lodged permanently in his brain. And a white bakery box from the Haitian patisserie on 116th Street that his mother had declared on her last visit to New York. I produced the only acceptable cinnamon cake outside of Lagos. He had his overnight bag in the trunk. He had a speech prepared in his head that he delivered every year on his own birthday, a speech about what she had given him and what she had sacrificed, and how none of it, none of the degrees and the career and the salary and the government credentials in his breast pocket, none of it existed without her. He was 1 block from Ashford Street when he saw the police cruiser. Kevin Williams was, among other things, a man who had spent 15 years studying the relationship between law enforcement and the people it was supposed to serve. He had read more case files than he could count. He had interviewed hundreds of witnesses. He had stood in courtrooms and made arguments about what happens when police authority is misapplied. And he had done it not as an academic exercise, but as the central work of his professional life. He was also a black man in America, which meant he had his own relationship with the sight of police vehicles parked outside the houses of people he loved that had nothing to do with his credentials and everything to do with something older and more visceral. He pulled to the curb on the cross street. Ashford was partially blocked by what looked like a moving truck 2 doors down. And he sat for a moment looking at the cruiser outside his mother's house, at the front door of his mother's house, which was open. Which wasn't how his mother left her front door. Which wasn't how his mother left anything. Kevin set the bakery box on the passenger seat. He got out of the car. He left the flowers. He walked toward the house with the particular controlled speed of a man who is managing the gap between what his instincts are telling him to do and what his training is telling him to do. And he walked through the open front door of his mother's home, and he stopped. The gel was on the floor. The amber beads. He knew those beads. He had grown up knowing those beads. He had held them as a child when his mother let him sit in her lap and touch the things that mattered to her most, were scattered everywhere across the hardwood. The hallway table was knocked askew. A framed photograph of Kevin at his law school graduation had fallen from the wall, and the glass was cracked. And his mother was on the floor. Face pressed against the hardwood, hands cuffed behind her back, the purple Ankara dress twisted around her body. The left side of her face, visible from where Kevin stood in the doorway, was already beginning to swell and darken. Standing over her, his knee recently removed, but the position of his body still broadcasting what it had been doing, was a large white officer with Patton on his chest. Kevin Williams had spent 15 years building the professional capacity to remain composed in situations where composure was the most powerful tool available. He had cross-examined murderers without raising his voice. He had stood in front of federal judges and delivered arguments about atrocities with the steady, methodical precision of a surgeon. He had done these things because he understood that controlled power is more dangerous and more effective than power expressed as rage. He understood this intellectually, professionally, completely. What happened inside his chest when he looked at his mother on the floor of her own home was not intellectual. It was not professional. It was the oldest thing in him responding to the sight, and it required every piece of discipline he had ever built to convert it into something usable rather than something destructive. He set the bakery box down on the hallway table. He straightened his jacket. "Get your hands off my mother," Kevin Williams said. "Right now." His voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. Controlled the way the pressure before a storm is controlled, enormous force held in perfect containment. Patton turned. He took in Kevin, the suit, the build, the stillness, and his face went through a rapid and ugly series of calculations. None of those calculations arrived at the right answer. "Sir, this is an active situation. You need to step back outside." "I'm not stepping outside." Kevin walked into the hallway. He moved with the even, deliberate pace of a man for whom the room already belongs to him, because legally and morally it did. "This is my mother's home. I am her son. I am asking you clearly and directly. Remove those handcuffs from my mother's wrists. Right now." "Your mother interfered with a lawful police investigation and remove the handcuffs." Reed was standing near the entrance to the kitchen, and Kevin looked at him. Really looked at him. The look of a prosecutor assessing a witness, looking for the fault line, the place where what the person knows and what they've been doing have come apart. "Officer," Kevin said, "what is your name?" "Reed. Marcus Reed." The young officer's voice was careful, like someone walking on ice. "Court, Officer Reed." Kevin kept his voice even and direct. "What was the specific address on the dispatch call?" Reed hesitated, a fraction of a second, but Kevin saw it. Patton handled the call. "I need you to tell me the address on the call." It was Ashford Street. Was it specifically 1847 Ashford? Or was it possible there was some confusion in the address? Another hesitation. Longer this time. Patton was staring at his partner with an expression that was half warning and half fury. Kevin didn't wait for the answer. He pulled out his phone. He dialed 911. The operator answered within 2 rings. "This is Kevin Williams," Kevin said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hallway. "Senior Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, bar number 4721. I need immediate confirmation of a dispatch call for a domestic disturbance. I need to know the exact address on that call. Yes, right now. I'll wait." The hallway was very quiet while they waited. Betty had turned her head slightly. She couldn't lift it fully. The hip pain was too great. And her eyes found Kevin's. He looked at her, and something passed between them. Something that had no language and didn't need one. The wordless communication between a mother and a child that has its own entire grammar built of a shared lifetime. A supervisor came on the line. "Mr. Williams, I have the call in question in front of me. The active call from today's 1423 dispatch is logged to 1847 Ashland Street. A SHLAND. Domestic disturbance, male suspect. Reported weapon. There are no calls logged to 1847 Ashford Street. ASHFORD. Today or this week?" Kevin held the phone so the speaker was angled toward Patton. He watched Patton's face process what he was hearing. He watched the blood drain out of it with the steady, unstoppable certainty of a tide going out. "Ashland and Ashford," Kevin said. 3 blocks apart. Different streets. He lowered the phone. "Officer Patton, you kicked down the door of a 70-year-old woman on the wrong street. My mother told you that. She told you before you touched her. She told you to check your dispatch. And instead of checking, you put your hands on her." Kevin's voice remained steady, the kind of steady that has weight to it. "Officer Reed, did you verify the address before Officer Patton breached this door?" Reed's jaw tightened. He looked at the floor. "What, no?" "You little," Patton started. "Do not finish that sentence," Kevin said. He looked at Patton with eyes that had seen worse things than Carl Patton, and processed them and converted them into federal cases. "Remove those handcuffs from my mother's wrists. Do it right now, and do it carefully, because if you cause her any additional injury in the next 30 seconds, I will add it to the list of things I am going to spend the next year of my life making sure you answer for in a federal courtroom." Patton's hands shook. He reached for the key. He fumbled it. It fell and rang against the hardwood. He picked it up. He bent down and unlocked the cuffs, and the sound of them releasing was the best sound Kevin Williams had ever heard in his life. Kevin was on his knees beside his mother before Patton had finished standing up. "Mama." He put one hand on her back, the other on her face, not touching the swollen left side, cupping the right side gently. "Mama, look at me." Betty Williams turned her head. She found her son's face. She looked at him for a long, still moment, with the expression of a woman assessing damage, not her own, his, checking that what he had walked in to see had not broken something in him. "My hip, Kevin," she said. Her voice was steady. Not performing steadiness, genuinely steady. The steadiness of a woman who had made her peace with pain the first time she survived it at 20 years old in a refugee camp. "And my shoulder. Something is wrong with my shoulder." "Okay." He slid one arm gently under her, supporting her weight. "Okay, Mama. Can you sit up if I help you?" "Yes." She was already moving, already marshaling herself, and already the most disciplined person in the room. She sat up with Kevin's support, and then she reached up with her better arm and found her gel. It was lying beside her on the floor. and she set it back on her head. Not perfectly, not the way she had tied it that morning, but back in place, back where it belonged. Because Betty Williams was not going to sit on the floor of her own home with her head uncovered in front of a man who had knocked it off. Kevin helped her to the hallway chair. He settled her with her back straight and both feet on the floor, and then he stood up and looked at Marcus Reed. "Kitchen," Kevin said. "There should be a tin of biscuits on the second shelf. She may need sugar. She's a heart patient and she's had a shock. Get them." Reed moved immediately and was back in 45 seconds with the biscuit tin. Kevin took two, put them in his mother's hand, and then turned back to face Carl Patton. He took his phone back out. He dialed. "This is Williams. I need the duty agent at FBI Newark, Civil Rights Division. Yes, I'm the scene. I have an officer-involved civil rights violation, an assault, and a false arrest. I need a team at 1847 Ashford Street, Newark. Now, not when it's convenient." He hung up and dialed again. "A G. Morrison's office. This is Kevin Williams. Is the Attorney General available? Tell her it's a civil rights situation and I'm standing in it." He waited 4 seconds. "Pat, it's Kevin. Yeah, I need you to listen to me." Carl Patton watched him make the calls. He watched the particular efficiency of a man who knows exactly who to call and exactly what to say. And he felt the floor shifting under him in the way that floors shift when you realize too late that what you were standing on was not solid ground. "You can't," he started. Kevin lowered the phone slightly and looked at him. "Section 242 of Title 18, he said quietly. "Deprivation of rights under color of law. You kicked down this door without a warrant and without verified probable cause. You assaulted and falsely arrested a civilian who committed no crime. Those are federal offenses, Officer Patton. And I have spent 15 years building cases against people like you." He raised the phone back to his ear. "Pat, yes. Here's what I need." In the kitchen, the agouti soup had stuck to the bottom of the pot. The jollof rice was fine. Betty always cooked jollof on low, and low was forgiving of distraction. The puff-puff under the dish towel was still warm. Betty sat in the hallway chair with her copper bangles on her wrists and her geel back on her head, eating a biscuit, listening to her son dismantle Carl Patton's life with the same calm focus with which he did everything else. She had raised him right. Within 90 minutes, 1847 Ashford Street looked like a different kind of crime scene than the one Carl Patton had intended to create when he'd walked through the door. FBI Special Agent Melissa Torres of the Newark Civil Rights Division arrived first, in an unmarked Tahoe with 3 agents and a forensic photographer. They documented everything: the shattered door frame, the scrape marks on the hardwood from Betty's fall, the scattered amber beads. Torres had them photographed individually in situ before anyone touched them. Each one cataloged like the evidence it was. The marks on Betty's wrists from the handcuffs, photographed before the paramedics treated them. The bruising on Betty's upper arm where Patton had grabbed her, 4 distinct finger marks, already darkening, visible even against Betty's dark skin. The EMTs arrived 2 minutes after Torres. They examined Betty in the hallway chair. She had refused to be moved to the floor or the sofa because she had spent enough time on the floor of this house today, and she was not going back down. Their assessment was careful and serious. Possible pelvic fracture, requiring imaging to confirm. Left shoulder showing signs of dislocation. The joint had gone in and come partially back, the most painful of the available options. Left wrist with compression injury. Left cheekbone, possible fracture. Her same caveat, blood pressure significantly elevated. "We need to transport you," the lead EMT, a woman named Calderon, told Betty. "Your blood pressure is high enough that we don't want to wait." "I know my blood pressure," Betty said. "I was a nurse for 23 years. I know what it means." She looked at Kevin, who was standing beside her. I need to turn off the soup." "I'll turn off the soup, Mama. And cover the puff-puff. Don't let it." "I'll cover everything, Mama. I'll clean up. You go with them." Betty looked at him for a moment with the searching, assessing look of a mother, determining whether her child is capable of managing the kitchen in her absence. She apparently concluded he was. New Jersey Attorney General Patricia Morrison arrived at 4:15 in a state police vehicle. She was a compact, deliberate woman with 20 years in civil rights law and the particular quality that comes from those 20 years. She did not perform concern. She simply had it, consistently, and it showed up in the specificity of her attention. She walked through the front door, carefully, avoiding the forensic markers on the floor, and went directly to Kevin, and then directly to Betty in the hallway chair, and she looked at Betty's face with the expression of someone filing something permanently. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "I'm Patricia Morrison, the Attorney General. I'm very sorry this happened to you in your home." Betty studied her. "Are you going to do something about it?" "Yes," Morrison said simply. "Then I'm glad to meet you." Morrison turned to her state police detail. "Find Patton. He surrenders his weapon and his badge to me in the next 10 minutes, or I call the department's commissioner directly." She looked at Reed, who was standing near the door, looking like a man waiting to be struck by lightning. "You. Come with me." Patton was located 2 houses down, standing by his cruiser. He had the look of a man who had been trying to figure out which direction to walk in, and had realized that all directions led to the same place. He handed over his gun and badge to Morrison's detail, with shaking hands, that he was making no effort to control. Reed was separated and interviewed by Torres in the kitchen, while Kevin sat with Betty in the hallway, holding her hand, while Calderon prepared the transport. Inside the kitchen, Agent Torres opened her notebook. Reed sat at Betty's kitchen table, in Betty's kitchen chair, and surrounded by the evidence of Betty's morning, the covered puff-puff, the pot of soup, the particular smell of a home that was built around the act of feeding people. And he told Torres everything. Not just what he'd witnessed in the last 2 hours, what he'd been witnessing for months. The pattern of calls where Patton escalated when de-escalation was available. The complaints he'd heard about from other officers about Patton's conduct in situations involving minority residents. The specific, damning, precise fact that Patton had known, Reed said, his voice tight, that the address was probably wrong. That Patton had said in the car, on the way over, that dispatch often got the streets confused in this neighborhood, and they should be careful, and had then proceeded to kick the door in anyway. Betty was loaded into the ambulance at 5:07 p.m. She walked out of the house under her own power, refusing the stretcher, moving slowly with Kevin's arm under her elbow, and the careful, terrible dignity of a woman who does not intend to exit her own home in any way that looks like defeat. She was wearing the purple Ankara still. The jewel was still on her head, somewhat off-center, but present. The copper bangles were at her wrists. The amber beads were not. They were in a small evidence bag in Torres's kit, to be photographed and returned. Betty had asked about them once, and then not asked again. As she reached the front door, she stopped. She turned around and looked back at the hallway, at the knocked photograph, the scattered floor, the place where 32 years of careful, a loving ordinary life had been violated in the space of 15 minutes. Then she looked forward again and walked out into the afternoon air. Kevin watched the ambulance drive away, and then he turned back to the house. He had calls to make. He had a case to build. And he had something else, something he had felt since the moment he walked into the hallway and saw his mother on the floor. A specific, cold, professional fury that was not the hot kind, not the kind that burns out quickly and leaves damage in its wake. The cold kind. The kind that keeps. He went back inside, turned off the stove burners, covered the food, and picked up the amber beads he could find from the floor. He set them in a small bowl on the counter. Then he sat at his mother's kitchen table and opened his laptop. He called Sandra Park at 8:30 that evening. Sandra Park had worked with Kevin for 8 years. She was methodical, relentless, and possessed of a near supernatural ability to locate information that other people had decided was safely buried. She had a gift for archives, for the specific understanding that information is rarely destroyed, only reclassified, only moved, only placed behind the assumption that no one will come looking. "Sandra," Kevin said, "I need a full service history on Carl Patton, Newark PD, badge 4471, prior departments, complaints, civil suits, disciplinary proceedings, everything." "How fast?" "Yesterday." She called back at 11:52 p.m. The story Sandra Park had found was not a story that began that afternoon at 1847 Ashford Street. It was a story that began 15 years ago, in 3 different cities, in 3 different departments, and the only continuous thread running through it was Carl Patton. He had started with the Trenton PD 14 years earlier. He had left after 2 years, citing personal reasons, though Sandra had found an internal affairs memo suggesting that his departure had been encouraged after a use of force complaint from a 61-year-old Guatemalan man named Hector Reyes, whose arm had been broken during a welfare check. The complaint had been filed. A review had been opened. The review had been closed after 8 months with no finding, and Carl Patton had been allowed to transfer to the Camden City PD, where he had spent 4 years, where he had accumulated 9 excessive force complaints in those 4 years, 7 of them involving Black or Hispanic residents, none of them resulting in formal discipline. One of them resulting in a civil settlement of $95,000 paid by the city to a 56-year-old Korean woman named Jinna Park, whose wrist had been broken during a traffic stop, with a standard non-disclosure clause. He had left Camden for Newark 5 years ago. In Newark, he had acquired 4 more complaints. 2 were still technically open. 2 had been closed. None had resulted in any formal action against him. "There's more," Sandra said. Kevin, who had been sitting at his mother's kitchen table, taking notes on a legal pad, with the focused, quiet intensity of a man building a structure 1 stone at a time, looked up from the pad. "There's a civil rights complaint filed 4 years ago by a woman named Patricia Johnson, African American, 54 at the time. She alleged excessive force and inappropriate contact during a traffic stop. She has an attorney. The case was settled 18 months ago for $160,000. Non-disclosure." Sandra paused. "Kevin, the NDA has a specific carve-out for federal criminal proceedings. She can talk." Kevin set down his pen. He looked at the bowl of amber beads on the counter. "Get me her attorney's contact," he said. "And Sandra, I need you to reach anyone else you can find who has filed against Patton. Any prior department, any time period. I don't care how old. I want them all. By morning? By morning." He sat at his mother's kitchen table until 2 a.m., building the architecture of what was coming. Then he drove to Hargrove General, where Betty Williams was in a room on the 3rd floor, with a fractured pelvis confirmed by imaging, a partially dislocated shoulder that had been manipulated back into place under sedation, a wrist compression injuries, and a cheekbone fracture that the radiologist said was hairline and would heal without surgery. She was awake when Kevin came in. She was watching the small television in the corner, with the sound turned low, a Nigerian soap opera on a streaming channel, something she watched when she couldn't sleep. "You should go home," she told Kevin. "You need rest." "I need 5 minutes," Kevin said. He sat in the visitor's chair and took her hand, the right one, the one without the bandage. "Then I'll go." He told her what Sandra had found. He told her about Reyes and Jinna Park and Patricia Johnson. He told her about the 15 years and the 3 departments and the pattern that was only invisible because no one had yet put all the pieces in one room and looked at them together. Betty listened without interrupting. She was quiet for a moment when he finished, looking at the television though she wasn't watching it. "This man has been hurting people for 15 years, she said. And they kept moving him. They kept giving him more people to hurt." "Yes," Kevin said. "And the people he hurt. They didn't have anyone." Kevin held her gaze. "Most of them, no." Betty nodded. Slowly, the way she nodded when she was making a decision. "Then this cannot just be about me," she said. "If we do this, Kevin, if we do this, it has to be for all of them. The people who filed complaints and got nothing. The ones who were told to be quiet. All of them." She looked at him directly. "Promise me." Kevin looked at his mother, this woman who had walked out of a war with nothing and built everything, and he said, "I promise, Mama." She squeezed his hand once and then released it and looked back at the television. "Now, go home and sleep," she said. "You can't fight anyone on no sleep. I raised you better than that." The video appeared at 6 a.m. on Monday. It had not been leaked. Kevin had insisted on that, not because he was interested in controlling the narrative, but because he understood that the difference between footage that is released officially, through proper channels, with the full weight of the U.S. Attorney's Office behind it, and footage that is leaked anonymously, is the difference between a weapon and a rumor. One of those ends careers and changes policy. The other generates outrage for a news cycle. What was released through Agent Torres's office, coordinated with the Newark Field Office's Public Affairs Division, and was the footage from Marcus Reed's body camera. Reed's camera had been functioning perfectly throughout the entirety of the incident. The footage was 6 minutes and 43 seconds long. It began with the approach to the door, the exterior of 1847 Ashford Street, the front door, the afternoon light on the steps. It captured the pounding. It captured Betty's voice. "I'm coming. One moment, please." It captured the kick. It captured everything that followed with the impartial, indifferent clarity that cameras have. No editorializing, no interpretation, no union rep explaining what the officer meant to do or what the subject should have done differently. Just the record of what happened, in the order in which it happened, in the house where it happened. By noon, the footage had been aired by 4 national networks, 2 cable news channels, and had been embedded in 17,000 social media posts. By 2 in the afternoon, the hashtag Justice for Betty was the #1 trending topic in the United States, and it was trending in 12 other countries. By 6 that evening, Kevin had received calls from 4 members of Congress, 2 civil rights organizations, and a documentary filmmaker he had never met, who wanted to know if Betty would be willing to be interviewed. Newark PD held a press conference at 3 p.m. The chief, a man named Ferrara, who had the look of someone who had prepared remarks for a very different kind of press conference and was now trying to adapt them in real time, read a statement expressing concern and describing the situation as under review. He did not say the word assault. He did not say the word excessive. He did not say the name Betty Williams without the qualifying phrase alleged circumstances. Kevin watched the press conference from his mother's hospital room. He noted every omission. The police union moved within 48 hours. They retained Gerald March, who was known in certain circles as someone who had a specific gift for taking the worst possible facts and constructing from them a narrative that was technically coherent, even when it was morally bankrupt. March's specialty was, specifically, the reframing of victims. He did not deny facts. He recontextualized them. The counter-narrative appeared first in comment sections, anonymous, untraceable, unplausibly deniable, and then in more organized form, in a statement from the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association that expressed concern about rush to judgment and the dangerous climate facing officers who must make split-second decisions. There were, March's operatives ensured, questions raised about Betty's level of cooperation, about whether the language barrier, entirely fictional since Betty Williams spoke more precise English than Carl Patton, but useful as a suggestion, had created genuine confusion about whether the situation had been properly understood before judgment was rendered. Kevin tracked the counter-narrative with the focused attention of a man who has spent 15 years in courtrooms watching this exact playbook run. He had seen it before. He knew every page. He also knew what was going to break it. Cassandra Park had, by the Thursday after the incident, located 7 individuals who had filed complaints against Carl Patton across his 3 departments. Of those 7, 5 were willing to speak. Of those 5, 3 had non-disclosure agreements with the carve-out that Sandra had identified. The federal criminal carve-out that meant they could testify in federal proceedings without violating the terms of their settlements. Patricia Johnson, 58, sat in Kevin's temporary office the following week and told her story for the first time publicly. She was a small, composed woman with the particular composure of someone who has rehearsed a difficult thing and delivered it carefully to a trusted person, and is now doing it again for what she hopes will be the last time. Hector Reyes, 73, told his story through an interpreter, though he would have managed in English. He told it with the patient, slightly remote quality of someone describing something that happened to someone they used to be. Jinnah Park, 60, told her story in English that was excellent and precise, and she had brought a folder of documents with her. Photographs of the injury, medical records, a copy of the settlement offer, a diary entry from the day of the incident, organized with the meticulous care of someone who had always known that someday these would matter. Each story was its own complete and terrible thing. Each story was also a piece of the larger thing that Kevin was building, a thing that was, when you put all the pieces together, not a story about one incident and one bad officer. It was a story about a system that had moved Carl Patton from Trenton to Camden to Newark, that had paid his victims to be quiet, that had written reports that said insufficient evidence, while the evidence was sitting in filing cabinets in 3 different cities. And that had allowed the accumulation of 15 years of harm to people who were, to the people doing the allowing, the kind of people whose harm could be afforded. Kevin Williams had promised his mother he would make it count for all of them. He built the federal case around all of them. The depositions began 6 weeks after the incident, in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's office in Newark. Betty Williams arrived in a forest green Ankara boo-boo with cream-colored embroidery along the collar, a different dress from the purple one, because the purple one had gone to the forensic lab, and in any case, Betty had decided it needed a rest. Her jewel was tied in a slightly simpler style than the one she had worn on the day of the incident, but it was tied perfectly. Her amber beads were back around her neck. Torres had returned them the previous week, all but 3 that couldn't be recovered from under the baseboards, and Betty's sister had sent a matching set of 3 from Lagos to replace them. The copper bangles were at her wrists. She walked into the conference room with a cane that she had accepted from the physical therapist, with the specific reluctance of a woman who considers dependency on mechanical assistance a temporary arrangement. Gerald March was already at the table, and he was a man of 60, with good suits and a particular quality of surface warmth, the warmth of someone who has spent decades deploying warmth as a strategic instrument. He stood when Betty entered, not out of courtesy, but out of the kind of theater that well-practiced attorneys put on for moments that might someday be described to someone important. Kevin was there, not as her attorney. That was a conflict he had carefully managed, retaining instead a civil rights litigator named Diane Osei, who was widely considered to be among the 5 best in the region, but as her son. He sat beside her, not between her and March. Beside her, which is different. March began with the kind of framing questions that are designed to feel like orientation, but are actually architecture. He was building, from the beginning, on the structure of a specific story. The story in which Betty Williams had been confused, had been unable to communicate clearly, had perhaps been experiencing the kind of cognitive disruption that is, after all, not uncommon in the elderly. "Mrs. Williams," March said in his warmest, most regretful voice, "would you say that your English is fully fluent? That you're able to communicate complex ideas without difficulty?" Betty looked at him. "I have a nursing degree from the University of Lagos, a professional certification from the United States Department of Health, and I have lived and worked in this country for 42 years. I was nominated for Employee of the Year at University Hospital 3 times. Would you like me to explain the physiology of the hip fracture your client gave me? Or would you prefer a simpler demonstration of my fluency?" March wrote something on his legal pad. "Of course. And on the day in question, do you feel you were able to clearly communicate with the officers?" "I communicated with complete clarity," Betty said. "The problem was not my communication. The problem was that your client did not intend to listen to me, regardless of what I said. Whether I spoke in English or Igbo or Mandarin Chinese, the outcome would have been the same. I know this because I told him, clearly in English, that he had the wrong house. And he kicked me to the floor anyway." March pivoted. He changed angles, tried another approach, built a different structure. Over the next 4 hours, he tried 17 different configurations of the same essential argument, that Betty's response to the officers had been, in some way that he could not quite name directly, but could surround with suggestion, a contributing factor. That confusion had existed on both sides. That Carl Patton, a stressed officer in a high-pressure job, had made a decision in a difficult moment. Betty dismantled every configuration with the same tool, the specific, precise, calm truth, delivered without heat and without hesitation. "Mrs. Williams," March said, near the end of the deposition, "Officer Patton has expressed to me privately that he is deeply sorry for what happened. Does that matter to you?" Betty considered the question. She looked at it from several angles, the way she looked at problems, directly, without sentiment, without the impulse to arrive at any answer other than the accurate one. "If Officer Patton is sorry," Betty said, "he can tell me himself. In a courtroom, under oath, where sorry means something, because everything means something under oath." She adjusted the cane against her knee. "A private sorry is just a quiet hope that the problem goes away. I am not a problem that goes away." March looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed his legal pad. Later, in the hallway outside the conference room, Kevin walked beside his mother toward the elevators, and she said, without looking at him, "That man thinks he is clever." "He is clever," Kevin said. "So are we," Betty said, and she pressed the elevator button. 2 things broke the case open in the weeks before trial. The first was Patricia Johnson's testimony. Patricia Johnson, who had filed her complaint 4 years ago and signed her non-disclosure agreement 18 months later, and spent the intervening time carrying what she knew in the private, exhausting way that people carry things they've been legally instructed not to speak, came forward with the federal carve-out and spoke for 3 hours to Agent Torres and Kevin's team. She described the traffic stop. She described what Patton had said to her. She described the 6 months of medical treatment that followed. She described the moment the settlement offer had arrived and the particular kind of defeat that accepting it had felt like, not because she hadn't deserved the money, she had, but because the money came with silence attached, and the silence felt like another injury. "I knew it would happen again," Patricia Johnson said. "I knew, but when I signed that paper, that it was going to happen again. Because nothing changed. Because nothing was ever going to change unless someone made it change." She looked at Kevin across the table. "I'm glad it was your mother," she said, and then caught herself. "That sounds wrong. I'm not glad she was hurt." "I understand what you mean," Kevin said. "I'm glad it was someone who has someone," Patricia said. "I didn't have someone. And that's the whole point, isn't it? That's what makes it work. They count on us not having someone." The second thing was a file number. Sandra Park, who had spent 3 weeks pursuing a notation she had found in the Camden City PD's records, a reference to footage from a 2019 incident. It logged into evidence as Exhibit 7C under a civil complaint that had been settled and sealed, located the server where the footage had been archived. The server was in a Camden City evidence technology warehouse. It had not been powered on in 4 years. Kevin made a call. A forensic digital recovery firm with a federal contract sent a team. The footage was recovered on a Wednesday afternoon. Kevin viewed it that evening in Agent Torres's office, alone except for Torres. It was 11 minutes long. The first 4 minutes showed a routine traffic stop. The last 7 minutes showed Carl Patton, a slightly younger Carl Patton, 4 years fewer lines in his face, but otherwise recognizably the same man, committing on camera. So in the parking lot of a convenience store with his body camera running, and the apparent conviction that the footage would never be found. An act of deliberate, gratuitous, premeditated cruelty against a handcuffed individual who posed no threat and was actively asking to be heard. Kevin watched it once, completely, without expression. Then he looked at Torres. "This goes to the prosecution. All of it. And I want Camden City PD's current chief on the phone tomorrow morning, because they have some explaining to do about how this footage ended up in an archive instead of a courtroom." Torres was already reaching for her phone. The trial of United States versus Carl Patton opened on a gray Tuesday in October at the Frank Lautenberg Federal Building in Newark. The media presence was what Kevin had expected: substantial, organized, and divided. On outside the courthouse, the two sides that had been forming since the video dropped were visible and audible: the union supporters with their signs, and the considerably larger crowd that had driven or bussed or walked to Newark from across the region to be present for a trial they considered personally relevant. Inside the courtroom, Betty Williams sat in the front row of the gallery behind the prosecution's table. She wore royal blue Ankara, a wide, flowing fabric with a pattern of white and gold chevrons, and her jewel was tied in the full, formal, highest occasion style that she reserved for church, for weddings, for the funerals of people she had loved deeply, and now for this. She wore the amber beads. She wore the copper bangles. She carried her cane. She looked like what she was, a woman who has survived everything that has been thrown at her and who intends to be present for the accounting. Carl Patton sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit that March had clearly selected. Conservative, non-threatening, the sartorial equivalent of a character reference. He had gained weight in the months since the incident. He had the look of a man in the later stages of understanding what is happening to him. March's opening statement was as expected, well-constructed, emotionally resonant for a certain kind of listener, strategically designed to insert doubt about intention without defending the outcome. He used the phrase split-second decision 4 times. He used the word difficult 7 times. He described Carl Patton as a decorated officer in a demanding profession who had made an error in a high-pressure situation and who had to live with the consequences of that error every day. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Kevin's colleague, Assistant U.S. Attorney Diana Reyes, who had been co-counsel on the case since the 2nd week. Kevin had recused himself from the prosecution role due to his relationship to the victim, but he had shaped the case, built the case, and was sitting in the gallery 3 feet from his mother, while Diana Reyes stood before the jury of 12 and said exactly what he would have said. "This is not a case about a difficult moment," she said. "This is a case about 15 years of difficult moments, about a pattern of choices made by one officer, in one department after another, or against one category of victim after another. The person in that hospital bed was 70 years old. She was in her own home. She was cooking her son's birthday dinner. She was wearing her traditional clothing. She told the officer in clear and perfect English that he had the wrong address, and he put her on the floor. Reyes let that sit for a moment in the silence of the courtroom. We will show you that this was not a mistake. We will show you that it was a continuation. The trial lasted 8 days. On the 3rd day, Betty took the stand. March had debated whether to cross-examine her. He had ultimately decided that he had no choice. To leave her testimony uncontested would be its own kind of damage. He approached the witness stand with his warmest, most regretful expression and his legal pad, and he asked his questions carefully, on surrounding them with so much courteous scaffolding that the questions themselves were almost obscured. Betty Williams answered every question directly, with no scaffolding at all. Mrs. Williams, you said in your testimony that you felt no one was listening. But isn't it possible that Officer Patton was listening, but simply interpreting the situation differently? No, Betty said. It is not possible. A person who is listening doesn't kick the door before the person on the other side has finished unlocking it. A person who is listening does not refuse to check their dispatch when asked. A person who is listening does not respond to an elderly woman raising her hands to show she is unarmed by throwing her to the floor. Betty looked at March with the precise, level, an unintimidated gaze of a woman who has stared at things considerably more frightening than a defense attorney in a good suit. Officer Patton was not listening. He had already decided, and I was what he had decided about. But Mrs. Williams, isn't it possible that in the stress of the moment, certain communications were— I want to say something, Betty said, that you have not asked me, and that I think needs to be in this room. She looked at the jury, not at March. I grew up in Nigeria. I came to this country 42 years ago because I believed, truly believed, that there was a system here that was fair, that there were rules that applied to everyone. I became a nurse. I became a citizen. I paid taxes. I raised children. I built a life in this country on the belief that the rules were real. She paused. What happened in my house was not just about me. It was about what happens when the rules stop applying to certain people. And I want this jury to understand that I am not here for revenge. I am here because the rules need to apply. That is all. The rules need to apply. The courtroom was very quiet. March looked at his legal pad. He did not ask another question. Marcus Reed took the stand on the 5th day. He had, in the months since the incident, been through a process that he described in his testimony as the most difficult of his life, and that was visible in the way he carried himself. The particular posture of someone who has done the hardest possible kind of accounting with themselves and is not yet at peace with the ledger. And he told the jury what he had told Torres in Betty's kitchen, that he had known the address was likely wrong, that he had said so in the car and been overridden, that he had watched what happened in that hallway and had chosen the hierarchy over the woman on the floor. He said it without legal padding, without hedging, with the specific, costly honesty of someone who has decided that the price of honesty is still less than the price of another lie. I should have stopped it, Reed said. I had the authority to intervene, and I didn't use it. And an innocent woman spent 3 days in the hospital because I chose my career over her safety. His hands were flat on the witness stand, very still. I don't have anything else to say about it. That's what happened. Patricia Johnson testified on the 6th day. Hector Reyes, through the translator, testified on the 6th day. Jinnah Park testified on the 7th day with her folder of documents and her excellent English and her patient documentary precision. The archival footage, the Camden City parking lot footage, recovered from the server that had sat powered off for 4 years, was introduced as Exhibit 31 on the 7th day. Thorne objected to its admission on the grounds of relevance and chain of custody. Judge Carmen Vasquez overruled both objections with the brisk efficiency of a judge who has already reviewed the chain of custody documentation and found it airtight. The courtroom watched 11 minutes of footage. In the first 4 minutes, Carl Patton looked like a police officer conducting a traffic stop. In the last 7 minutes, Carl Patton looked like what he was. When the footage ended, the courtroom was absolutely silent. Kevin, in the gallery, was looking at the jury. He watched 12 people process what they had just seen. He watched 12 people reconfigure everything they had heard from March and everything March's expert witnesses had said about split-second decisions and professional stress and the impossible difficulty of police work. He watched 12 people decide. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. It would have been less, but the foreperson, a retired public school principal named Mrs. Anita Dominguez, who had 40 years of practice in the art of managing groups of people toward decisions that had to last, had insisted on going through every count methodically, in order, with time for everyone to speak. When they returned to the courtroom on the afternoon of the 8th day, Kevin did not look at Patton. He looked at his mother. Betty Williams was sitting in the front row, with her spine completely straight, and both hands folded on top of her cane, and her eyes forward, fixed on the foreperson, with the expression of a woman who has waited a long time for something and intends to receive it with the dignity appropriate to the waiting. The foreperson stood. Her hands, Kevin noticed, were entirely steady. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, resulting in bodily injury, in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, we, the jury, find the defendant, Carl Patton, guilty. Somewhere in the gallery behind Kevin, someone exhaled. It was a sound like something releasing. On the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. On the charge of unlawful entry and burglary of a dwelling, guilty. On the charge of false imprisonment, guilty. On the charge of falsification of a police report, guilty. Patton's hands were flat on the defense table, and his head had dropped, and his shoulders had a particular configuration that Kevin recognized from 15 years of courtrooms, the configuration of someone for whom a door has just closed permanently. March was already rearranging his papers with the contained efficiency of a man beginning the mental process of transition. Betty Williams took one slow breath. Then she reached over and found Kevin's hand, which was on the gallery railing in front of him, and she held it. 6 weeks later, on a December morning when the first real cold of the season had arrived in Newark, Betty Williams walked into the federal courthouse for the last time in this matter. She wore a deep burgundy Ankara bubu with gold embroidery along the hem and sleeves, fabric she had selected specifically for today, not for Carl Patton, but for the other people in that courtroom. For Patricia Johnson, who was seated in the 3rd row. For the family of Hector Reyes, who had driven up from Trenton. For Jinnah Park, who was sitting in the 2nd row in a dark coat, with her folder on her lap, as though she might still need the documents, might still need to prove something to someone. Betty walked to the victim statement podium without assistance. She had left the cane at the end of the aisle. Kevin had offered to carry it forward, and she had declined. She looked at Carl Patton. He was seated at the defense table in a gray suit that was a size too large for him now. He looked at the table. "Look at me," Betty said. He looked up. "I want you to understand something," Betty said. Her voice was unhurried and clear, and it carried to every corner of the courtroom without any particular effort. "You did not break me. I was broken once before, years ago, by things larger than you, and I rebuilt myself from nothing. You will not be the thing that breaks me," she paused. "But you have to understand what you did. Not to me specifically. I will heal. I am already healing. You have to understand what you did to the idea that this country's rules apply to everyone. Because every time someone like you is protected by a system that was supposed to protect people like me, the idea becomes smaller. The idea that we matter, that our homes are our homes, that the law is ours too. She looked at him steadily. You made it smaller, and I am here because it needs to be bigger. That is why I am here. She walked back to her seat. Judge Carmen Vasquez looked at Carl Patton for a long moment. Then she looked at her notes, though she clearly did not need them. Mr. Patton, she said, the court has reviewed your service history, your prior complaints, the civil settlements, and the pattern of conduct that the prosecution has documented across 3 departments and 15 years. The court has also reviewed your statement, in which you described the incident as a mistake made under pressure. She paused. A mistake is something that happens once. What the court has reviewed is a pattern. A pattern is a choice, repeated. And choices, repeated, become who a person is. She straightened her notes. On count 1, deprivation of rights under color of law with bodily injury, I sentence you to 14 years in a federal correctional facility, on the additional counts, to be served concurrently. You are not eligible for parole consideration for the first 10 years of this sentence. You will report to FCI Cumberland within 30 days. The gavel came down. The sound bounced off the walls of the courtroom and dissipated. Carl Patton's hands were on the defense table. He looked at them. 2 marshals moved to the defense table, and he stood between them with the automatic compliance of a man who has run out of options, and they walked him toward the side door, and he went through it, and the door closed. Kevin Williams sat in the gallery beside his mother, and did not perform any reaction. He simply sat there, present, breathing, his hand finding his mother's, and holding it. Betty Williams looked at the place where Carl Patton had been. Then she looked at Patricia Johnson in the 3rd row, who had her hands pressed against her mouth and her eyes were full. Then she looked at the family of Hector Reyes. Then at Jinnah Park, who was sitting very straight with her folder on her lap and her eyes closed. Betty nodded once. For all of them. 3 months after sentencing, the New Jersey governor signed into law the Law Enforcement Address, Verification and Accountability Act. It required officers to verbally confirm a specific address with dispatch before any forced entry. Required body cameras to be active from the moment a call was received, not merely from the moment of arrival. It established an independent civilian review board with actual subpoena power for excessive force complaints across all departments in the state. The bill was informally called the Williams Provision. Betty had been invited to the signing ceremony. She stood beside the governor in a green and gold Ankara, jewel tied, copper bangles jingling, and she spoke for 3 minutes about why the law mattered. This law is not for me, she said. I already got my justice. This law is for the next person, for whoever she is, wherever she lives, whatever she is wearing when someone with a badge decides she is nobody. This law says, you are not nobody. You have never been nobody. And now the law knows it too. Newark PD underwent what the Department of Justice, which had placed it under federal oversight, are described as a comprehensive structural review. The chief resigned. 6 officers, in addition to Patton, were separated from the department following a review of their complaint histories. The union leadership changed. Marcus Reed left the Newark Police Department on the day of Patton's sentencing. He enrolled in a master's program in public policy and began working with a community organization that ran police accountability training for new recruits in 3 New Jersey counties. He was not particularly forgiving of himself. He was working on it. Patricia Johnson called Kevin 2 months after the sentencing. She didn't have a specific reason for calling, she said. She just wanted to say that she had slept through the night, full 8 hours, for the first time since 2019. She thought he should know. Kevin thanked her. He meant it. 1 year later, on the 12th of March, a year to the day, Betty Williams was in her kitchen at 1847 Ashford Street. The doorframe had been rebuilt. The hardwood had been refinished where it had been marked. The photograph of Kevin at his law school graduation had a new frame, larger than the old one, and it hung in the same spot in the hallway. The amber beads were around Betty's neck, the original ones that Torres had returned, plus the 3 replacements her sister had sent, which were slightly lighter in color, and which Betty could tell apart, but which were present and accounted for. She was wearing the purple Ankara. She had taken it back from the forensic lab, washed it 3 times with the particular gentle soap she used for her good fabrics, and hung it in the sun to dry. It was back in her closet, back in rotation, because Betty Williams was not going to let Carl Patton own her favorite dress. She was making jollof rice. She had been up since 6. Kevin arrived at 2 o'clock with alstroemeria, yellow, not roses, and the bakery box from 116th Street. Grace came an hour later with her twins, who were 4 years old, and who descended on Betty's kitchen with the cheerful, destructive energy of small people who know they are loved. David flew in from Seattle. He arrived at 5 with a bottle of Nigerian wine that he had found at an African grocery in Ballard and carried across the country specifically because Betty had mentioned once, years ago, that she missed it. The house filled up the way houses are supposed to fill up. The way Betty's house had filled up for 32 years, but with the accumulated warmth of a family that had been built from nothing, and that knew, in the specific way that families built from nothing, know exactly what it is worth. At dinner, Kevin raised his glass. "To Mama," he said, "who survived everything, and who made sure it meant something." "To Mama," the room said. Betty raised her own glass of Malta. She had never acquired the habit of wine, though she was polite about it. She looked around the table. The twins, who understood nothing and everything. Grace, who was trying not to cry and failing. David, who was not trying not to cry and succeeding only marginally better. Kevin, who was holding his glass with both hands and looking at her with the specific expression she had first seen on his face when he was 8 years old, and had understood for the first time that the world was not entirely fair, and had decided in that moment, in that kitchen 36 years ago, that he was going to do something about it. "I want to say something," Betty said. The room got quiet. Even the twins, who were not capable of voluntary quiet for more than 4 seconds, somehow managed it. "When that man came into my house, he thought he was taking something from me. He thought he was showing me what I was worth. He was wrong." She set her glass down. "What I am worth is in this room. It has always been in this room. He never had the ability to touch it. He just didn't know that." She picked her glass back up. "Now he knows. And now the law knows. And I am still here, still standing, in my own house, in my own dress." She smiled, the full, uncomplicated, radiant smile that her children had spent their entire lives trying to earn. "That is enough for me. That is more than enough," Kevin said. They ate dinner in the gold light of the evening. The windows steamed from the stove. The twins asleep in the living room by 8 o'clock. David washing dishes while Grace dried them and argued with him about the correct method. Kevin at the table with his second glass of water, watching his mother wrap the leftover puff-puff for them to take home. Betty caught him watching. "What?" she said. "Nothing," Kevin said. "I'm just looking." Betty wrapped another piece of puff-puff, then put the whole container in a bag and set it in front of him. "Take this. You never eat enough in New York." She sat back down across from him. "Kevin." "Yes, Mama." "You kept your promise." Kevin looked at her. "I tried." "You did more than try," Betty said. "Patricia Johnson slept through the night. Did you know that?" "She told me." Betty nodded. That is what a promise is for. She folded her hands on the table. Now, tell me about work. What are you working on? Kevin Williams set down his glass and began to talk about work, and his mother listened with the full, focused, genuinely interested attention that she had always given to the things her children told her. The attention that had made all three of them grow up believing that what they thought and did and built in the world was worth paying attention to, because she had always paid attention to it, because she had always made them feel like they mattered, which of course is where it all begins, with someone making you feel like you matter, with someone raising a child who grows up understanding that other people matter too, with a mother in a purple Ankara dress, her jewel tied high, her copper bangles jingling, her bare feet on the floor of her own kitchen. Still here. Still standing. Carl Patton spent 15 years behind a badge, moving from one department to another, finding the people he considered powerless and proving to himself over and over that he was right about them by hurting them and watching nothing happen. He was wrong about all of them. He was spectacularly wrong about Betty Williams. Betty Williams survived a civil war. She survived poverty, grief, isolation, and the particular grinding difficulty of building a life in a country that was not always interested in making that building easy. When Carl Patton put her on the floor of her own home, she did not break. She waited for her son. She ate her biscuit. She put her jewel back on her head. And then she went to court and told the truth and went home and made jollof rice. Some people are made of things that cannot be damaged by men like Carl Patton. Betty Williams is one of those people. She has always been one of those people. Carl Patton just didn't know it. Now he does. This story is for Betty. It is also for Patricia Johnson and Hector Reyes and Jenna Park and every person who filed a complaint and was told it was insufficient, who signed a settlement and was told to be quiet, who sat in a house that was their own and watched someone with a badge decide they were nobody. You are not nobody. You have never been nobody. And sometimes, not always, not easily, not without cost, the law can be made to know that too. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're taking from this. Stay safe. Stand strong. And remember, you never know who someone's mother raised.